She was delivered to his fence like freight, wrist rope burned to the bone, lips cracked from days without water, eyes that had long since stopped believing in mercy. The note pinned above her heart said only two words: paid, delivered. Caleb Horne hadn't ordered anything except grain and fence posts, but someone had forged his name, stolen his money, and used his reputation to purchase a human being. When she finally opened her eyes and whispered, "You paid for me. Just do it," he understood. This wasn't a mistake. This was a crime, and he was standing at the center of it. If you want to know how one man's choice to protect a stranger became the most dangerous decision of his life, stay with me until the very end. Hit like and drop the city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The heat came early to the Arizona Territory that summer of 1883, the kind of heat that arrived before dawn and never truly left, that pressed down on a man's shoulders like a physical weight and turned the distant Bradshaw Mountains into trembling mirages by the time the sun cleared the horizon. By 7 in the morning, the hard pan was already baked white. The earth cracked into jagged plates the color of old bone, and the sparse buffalo grass along the fence lines had gone brittle and pale as ash. Caleb Horne stood on the porch of the ranch house with a tin cup of coffee going cold in his hand, watching the light change over the eastern pasture. He'd been awake since well before dawn, as he always was, as he had been every morning for the 3 years since Nora died. Sleep had become a stranger to him in those years, visiting only in brief, restless intervals that left him more exhausted than rested, as though even an unconsciousness had grown impatient with his grief and refused to stay long. The ranch stretched out before him in every direction, 600 acres of scrub land and scattered grays that he worked alone. He'd let the hired hands go the spring after the funeral. He hadn't been able to stand their careful silences, the way their eyes slid away from his whenever Nora's name drifted into a sentence. Now it was just him and the cattle, the 2 horses, and the relentless Arizona sky. He drained the last of the cold coffee and was turning to go back inside when something snagged his attention out along the eastern fence line, maybe a quarter-mile out, where the post road ran parallel to his property before curving south toward Prescott. A shape that didn't belong, dark against the pale morning landscape, still in a way that felt wrong. Caleb set down his cup and walked to the corral, where his bay gelding, a horse he called Flint, for the color of its temperament more than its coat, stood already in the traces from his earlier perimeter check. He swung up, and they made their way east across the hard-packed earth, Flint picking his steps with the measured caution of an animal that had learned to read its rider's moods. As they drew closer, the shape resolved itself into a wagon. A supply wagon, canvas-covered and sitting motionless at the edge of his fence. The horse in the traces was a sorry specimen, ribs showing through a dull coat head, hanging low, too spent even to flick away the flies gathering at the corners of its eyes. There was no driver, no movement at all except the listless flutter of torn canvas in the faint morning breeze. Caleb reined in Flint a few yards out and sat still for a moment, listening. Nothing but the creak of the wagon's frame and the dry buzzing of insects. He dismounted slowly, one hand resting instinctively on the grip of the revolver at his hip. "Hello," he called. His voice sounded strange in the morning silence, too loud, too alone. "Anyone there?" No answer. He approached from the side, keeping his movements deliberate. The back of the wagon was covered by a drop of canvas, and the smell reached him before he could see inside: sweat and something darker underneath it, the particular smell of human suffering that he recognized from the war and had spent 2 decades trying to forget. He pulled back the canvas. His mind refused for a moment to process what lay before him. A woman, curled on her side on the bare wagon bed, her body folded into itself with the helpless compactness of the exhausted and the broken. Her wrists were bound with rough rope, the skin beneath raw and bleeding where she had pulled against it. Her dress, what had once been a dove-gray traveling dress of reasonable quality, was so fouled with dust, and worse, that its original color was barely guessable. Her hair had come loose from whatever arrangement it had been in and lay in matted ropes across her face. Even in unconsciousness, her features were drawn tight with pain. "Lord Almighty." Caleb breathed the words escaping before thought could catch them. He climbed into the wagon bed and crouched beside her, and up close he could see the bruises, dark crescents on her upper arms, where fingers had gripped and held a fading yellow-green shadow along her jaw. She couldn't have been more than 25, though suffering had a way of blurring age, layering years onto a face that had no business carrying them. A piece of paper was pinned to the front of her dress just above her heart. Caleb pulled it free with fingers that had gone unsteady without his permission and smoothed it out against his palm. 2 words, written in a blocky, crude hand on a scrap of yellowed paper. Paid. Delivered. The world seemed to tilt slightly beneath him. He read the words again, then again, as though repetition might change their meaning. It didn't. Paid. Delivered. Like she was a side of beef. Like she was a crate of supplies. He crumpled the note in his fist and pulled the knife from his belt, working carefully at the knots that bound her wrists. They were tight, professional, the kind tied by someone who knew what they were doing, who had done it before, and expected to do it again. He sawed through them without cutting her, and when the rope fell away, she stirred. A sound escaped her, not quite a word, not quite a cry, more the involuntary vocalization of a body surfacing from very deep water. Her eyes opened. They were the color of a winter sky just before snow, a pale, clear gray that might have been beautiful under other circumstances. They focused slowly, then found his face. And what he saw in them hit him somewhere in the chest he hadn't expected to be hit. Not fear, not hope. Something emptier than either. Recognition, maybe. The recognition of an animal that has been in a trap so long, it has stopped trying to identify the hands that approach it and simply waits. "You paid for me," she said. Her voice was raw, stripped nearly to nothing. "Now do it." Caleb rocked back on his heels. "What? Do it?" Her eyes never left his face. "Whatever you paid for. I won't fight anymore." The flatness of those words was worse than screaming would have been. He had heard screaming before on battlefields, in hospitals, in the dark hallway outside Nora's bedroom in those last terrible weeks. Screaming still contained resistance. What he heard in this woman's voice contained none. She had gone somewhere beyond resistance, somewhere beyond the ordinary vocabulary of fear, into a place where nothing was left except the bare waiting for whatever came next. "No," Caleb said, and then more carefully, "No, I didn't pay for anything." Something shifted in those gray eyes, not belief. She was far past believing anything easily, but confusion at least. The machinery of understanding still turning, if slowly. "The note," she said. "Your name." "What name? There's no name on that note, just 2 words. He held up the crumpled paper, then thought better of showing her and set it aside. "Who told you my name?" Her lips moved. He had to lean close to hear. "The man who brought me. He said the name of the rancher who paid. Said I belong to him now." A shallow breath. "Caleb Horne." He said, "Caleb Horne." Cold fury began to build behind Caleb's sternum, slow and deliberate as a fire catching in green wood. Someone had used his name, had forged his identity, spent money associated with him, arranged for a human being to be delivered to his fence like a parcel of dry goods. "What man?" he asked, keeping his voice level. "What did he look like?" But she had drifted again, her breathing going shallow, her eyes closing despite herself. He pressed 2 fingers to the side of her throat and found her pulse weak, unsteady, but present. She was alive. For now, that would have to be enough. Getting her onto Flint was awkward business, and the gelding stood with unusual patience through the whole of it, as though he understood something was wrong and had decided to be useful about it. Caleb settled her across the saddle and mounted behind her, keeping one arm around her waist. He talked as they rode, not because he thought she could hear him, but because the silence felt wrong. "You're going to be all right. I'm taking you somewhere safe. Nobody's going to put their hands on you. You're going to be all right." The house was cool and dark after the blazing morning. Caleb carried her down the hall to the spare bedroom. The one that had been Nora's sewing room before the sickness took her use of her hands and laid her on the bed as carefully as he could manage. Then he stood back suddenly, uncertain, which was not a sensation he was accustomed to. She needed water. She needed food. She needed her wounds cleaned and dressed, and probably a doctor, though the nearest one was nearly 2 hours' ride south in Prescott. He started with water. When he returned with a pitcher and cup, she was watching him. Those gray eyes tracked his movement with the wariness of a cornered animal, measuring the distance between his hands and her body. "I'm going to give you some water," he said, keeping several feet between them. "Can you sit up, or do you need help?" She tried to push herself upright. Her arms buckled. She fell back against the pillow, and something crossed her face that might have been shame. "Here." He sat beside her carefully, giving her time to flinch away if she needed to, and slid an arm behind her shoulders. She went rigid at the contact but didn't pull back. He held the cup to her lips, and she drank in great desperate pulls, water running down her chin and soaking into the ruined collar of her dress, and she didn't stop, and she didn't apologize, just drank until the cup was empty, and then lay back gasping. Why? She asked when her breath steadied. Her voice was fractionally stronger. If you didn't pay for me, why bring me inside? Why not just turn me out? It was a fair question. A stranger's misery dropped at his doorstep. He had every reason to want no part of it. Because what was done to you is wrong, he said, and because whoever did it used my name to do it. That makes it my business whether I want it to be or not. She looked at him for a long moment. He could see her working through it, testing the statement against some internal measure of probability, and finding it not convincing exactly, but not immediately false either. I don't understand, she said. Neither do I yet, but I'm going to find out. He moved to leave and her voice stopped him, low effortful, like a woman calling across a distance that kept changing. My name is Adeline Marsh. I'm not nothing. I have a name. Caleb turned back. I know you're not nothing. I could see that the moment I found you. He held her gaze for just a moment, long enough for her to feel that he meant it, then went to heat water and gather what he needed from the medical cabinet that Nora had kept stocked out of the same methodical practicality that had defined everything she did. He worked in silence for a while. The morning sun climbed the wall of the spare bedroom in a slow stripe of gold while he cleaned Adeline's wrists with carbolic and bound them in clean linen. She bore it without complaint, jaw-set eyes fixed at some point above his left shoulder. How long, he asked when the worst of it was done. I don't know. A pause. I stopped counting. Weeks, maybe. Where did they take you from? A town called Beaumont, in Texas. Another pause, longer this time. I was a school teacher there. I answered an advertisement, a position in California. Good salary, respectable family room and board. The terms were generous, too generous maybe, but I needed the work and, She stopped. And you believed it. I wanted to believe it. Something flickered across her face. There's a difference when He tied off the last bandage and sat back. Was there a name, a man in charge of the men who took you? They didn't speak to me directly. Not at first. But the others, the women, they called him something. She swallowed. Voss. His name was Voss. Caleb went still. He knew that name. He knew it from the way you know a thing you wish you didn't. Not from personal acquaintance, but from rumor and careful avoidance, from the particular silence that falls over a room when certain names are spoken too loudly. Silas Voss, he said, less a question than a statement he was testing in his own mouth. Adeline looked at him sharply. You've heard of him. I've heard things. He rose from the chair and moved to the window. Outside, Flint was standing at the water trough, tail flicking at flies. The ranch was utterly still. He operates out of Prescott, has for years. People know what he does, but no one stops him. No one has yet. Caleb turned back to face her. That doesn't mean no one can. She studied him with those pale, exhausted eyes. You're one man, you live alone. You rarely come to town. She said it without cruelty, simply cataloging facts. What can one man do against someone like Voss? I don't know yet, Caleb said honestly, but I'm going to find out. He left her with water and food within reach, the door unlocked, but with its iron bolt accessible from the inside, and rode into Prescott before noon. The town was the largest settlement in that stretch of the territory, a proper county seat with a main street and a courthouse, and every variety of commerce that 2,000 souls required. Caleb had done his business here in the early years, coming in monthly for supplies and news. He'd come less often since Nora died. The town felt too loud now, too full of the kind of ordinary human life that had once seemed unremarkable and now felt almost cruel in its ordinariness. He tied Flint outside the general store and pushed through the door into the cool dimness. Walt Greaves stood behind the counter, a heavy-set man with kind eyes and a perpetual air of mild anxiety, as though he was always faintly worried that he'd miscounted something. He looked up as Caleb entered, and his expression shifted welcome, then something more complicated. Caleb Horne, haven't seen you since must be 3 months at least, getting to be a hermit up there. Walt, Caleb came to the counter and kept his voice even. I need to look at my account ledger. My last order. Walt's expression shifted again. Your last order was 2 months back. Feed and fence posts. He reached under the counter and produced a ledger, setting it flat between them. Here. Caleb looked down at the page. His name was at the top in Walt's neat, careful hand. Below it, the usual items in the usual amounts. And below that, in different writing blocky crude, the same hand that had written paid. Delivered a second entry. Special delivery. Prepaid in full. To be left at coal fence at sunrise. He stared at it. I didn't write that, Walt said quietly. He had gone the color of old candle wax. Caleb, I swear to you, I never wrote that. Someone must have, who had access to this ledger. Anyone who came in, my clerk, the delivery boys. Walt's voice dropped. There was a new driver. Came to me about 2 months back, said he was available for deliveries. Said Silas Voss had vouched for him. The name landed between them like a stone into still water. Voss, Caleb kept his voice flat. Voss sent you a driver. He has his hand in half the businesses in town. I didn't think. Walt looked down at the ledger, then up at Caleb, his face stricken. What was the delivery, Caleb? What did they leave at your fence? Caleb didn't answer. He was looking at the price column. $350 charged against his account. Money he had deposited with Walt months ago for future orders. The money's already been withdrawn, Walt said, voice barely above a whisper. 2 weeks ago, someone came in with what looked like your signature. It wasn't my signature. I know that now. Walt's hands pressed flat against the countertop. I'm sorry, I don't know what I should have done differently, but I'm sorry. Where's the driver now? Gone, left town 4 days ago without a word. Walt hesitated. Silas Voss has an office above the Red Lantern, second floor end of the hall. But Caleb, his voice tightened with real fear. Don't go up there alone. The man he's not someone you can reason with. He has protection. Territorial government, the sheriff men on the bench. Thank you, Walt. Caleb. But Caleb was already through the door. The Red Lantern occupied the corner of Main and Copper, a 2-story building that had been painted the color its name suggested at some point in the past and had since faded to the dusty red of dried blood. A piano was playing inside, something cheerful that sounded obscene given the circumstances. 2 men stood at the entrance, one broad and heavy, one lean and watchful, with the particular stillnesses of men who were paid to stand and observe. Caleb crossed the street without slowing. Help you, the broad one asked. Here to see Voss. Tell him Caleb Horne's here. Tell him it's about a delivery. The 2 men exchanged a look. Something passed between them, recognition, calculation. Then the broad one disappeared inside, and the lean one watched Caleb with the unblinking focus of a rattlesnake that hasn't decided yet. After several minutes, he'll see you, second floor, end of the hall. The interior of the Red Lantern was what Caleb expected. Long bars, scattered tables, a few afternoon drinkers who looked up as he passed and looked away just as quickly. He climbed the back stairs slowly, his hand near his gun. The office at the end of the hall was larger than it had any right to be, paneled in dark wood and lit by 2 oil lamps even in the afternoon. Heavy curtains were drawn against the windows. A massive desk sat at the center of the room like a throne. Behind it sat Silas Voss. He was perhaps 55, with silver-streaked hair swept back from a broad forehead, the weathered face of a man who had once worked outdoors, and the soft, unworked hands of a man who now made others do it for him. His eyes were pale, almost colorless, the shade of water over limestone, and they fixed on Caleb with an expression of perfect, polished calm. Mr. Horne, he didn't rise. I understand you have some concern about a recent transaction. A woman was left at my fence this morning. Caleb remained standing, keeping the desk between them, bound, half-starved, with a note saying she'd been bought and paid for in my name. Voss tilted his head slightly. How terrible. Someone forged my signature at the general store, spent money from my account, used my name to falsify a purchase, and have a human being delivered to my property. Caleb kept his voice level with effort. The driver who made the delivery was sent to Walt Greaves by you. I recommend drivers to many local businesses. I'm a businessman, Mr. Horne. It's natural that I maintain relationships with. The woman says the man in charge of her captors was called Voss. The calm behind those pale eyes didn't crack, but something recalculated itself behind it. Caleb could see it happening, the adjustment, the reassessment. Traumatized women say many things, Voss said with the measured sympathy of a man who has practiced measured sympathy until it no longer resembles the real thing. Their memories are often unreliable, especially after her memory seemed clear enough to me. And yet here you are with no proof, no witnesses, nothing that would hold up to scrutiny in any court in this territory. Voss rose from his chair, unhurried, and came around the desk. He was taller than he'd appeared, seated a broad, solid man who had once been formidable and still carried the echo of it. Let me explain something to you, Mr. Horne. I am a man of considerable standing in this community. I have friends in the territorial legislature. I have friends among the judiciary. I have friends who would be deeply disturbed to hear that a grieving widower who rarely leaves his ranch had begun making unfounded accusations against a pillar of this town's commerce. Is that a threat? It's a clarification. Voss stopped a few feet away, close enough that Caleb could smell the pomade in his hair. The woman you found, whatever she told you, whatever she believes she is property that was legally purchased, legally transported, and legally delivered. If you're troubled by the methods, a small dismissive gesture, take it up with the delivery man, who I'm told has left town. A shame. She's not property. The bill of sale says otherwise. Voss returned to his desk with the unhurried confidence of a man who has never had to run from anything. And since your name appears on that bill of sale, Mr. Horne, I suppose that makes her your problem. Good day. Caleb stood in the middle of that carefully appointed room for 3 long seconds, his hand flat against his thigh, the fury behind his sternum cold and controlled and looking for a place to land. Then he turned and walked out, because staying would only get him killed, and getting killed would leave Adeline Marsh entirely alone. He rode back to the ranch in the last red light of afternoon, his mind working through the problem, the way you work through a tangle of fence wire, patiently looking for the place where the whole thing comes loose. Voss was right about one thing: Caleb had nothing that would stand up in court. A woman's word against a wealthy, connected man. A ledger entry in someone else's handwriting. A driver who had vanished. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough on its own. But there had to be something. Men like Voss didn't build what he'd built without leaving evidence somewhere, without someone who knew. He found Adeline in the kitchen when he returned, sitting at the table with a cup of tea going cold before her, her bandaged wrists resting in her lap, watching the door as if she'd been listening for his horse for the last hour. Voss admits nothing, Caleb said, pulling out the chair across from her. Claims the transaction was legal. Claims your property. Her face didn't change. She had expected exactly this. He could see it in the stillness of her expression. Not shock, not devastation, just the quiet confirmation of something she'd already known. So that's it, she said. There's nothing to be done. I didn't say that. She looked up at him. You said it yourself. He has protection. The law is in his pocket. My word against his. For now, Caleb leaned forward, elbows on the table, holding her gaze. But there's a way to take his legal claim off the table entirely. A way he can't challenge in any court in this territory. Adeline waited. Marriage, Caleb said. If you were legally married, his bill of sale means nothing. A married woman can't be claimed as property. His forged receipts, his fraudulent paperwork, none of it would have any standing. You'd be protected. A long silence. You're suggesting I find a husband, she said carefully. I'm suggesting you already have one, if you want. He met her eyes steadily. I'm not asking for anything, Adeline. Not expecting anything. This would be an arrangement, protection in name. Nothing more, Bihoam. And when it's over, when Voss is dealt with, and you're truly free, you go wherever you choose. No conditions, no claims. She stared at him across the table for a long moment. Outside, the last of the daylight was fading from the windows, painting the kitchen walls in shades of amber and rust. Why? She asked quietly. Why would you do this? You don't know me. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then, my wife died 3 years ago. I sat beside her for 18 months while she faded, and I couldn't do a single useful thing. Not one. He looked at his hands. After she was gone, I made myself a promise that if I ever had a real chance to help someone, Not just stand by and watch, I wouldn't let it pass. He looked up at her. You showed up at my fence, that's not nothing. Adeline said nothing for a long while. The kitchen settled into its evening sounds, the tick of the stove cooling the distant complaint of the windmill in the night breeze. I'll think about it, she said at last. Take whatever time you need. He left her there and went to sit on the porch with his rifle across his knees, watching the dark. Somewhere out there, Silas Voss was making plans. The evening star came out above the western ridge, pale and solitary, and Caleb Horne kept watch over a woman he barely knew, in a situation that was going to get considerably worse before it got better. He was certain of both. He found her answer in the morning. She was standing at the window of the sewing room when he knocked, watching the desert come alive in the early light, and she turned to face him before he had finished his second knock. Yes, she said without preamble. I'll marry you, Caleb Horne, but I want it understood. Go ahead. This is an arrangement, not a romance. I'm not your wife in anything but name. Her jaw was set, her gray eyes steady. And if I ever decide to leave, you leave. No conditions, no question asked. She studied him for one more moment, looking for the seam in the offer, the place where the generosity ended and the expectation began. She didn't find it. Then let's go, she said, before Voss has time to do anything about it. The minister in Prescott was a young man named Reverend Aldous, who seemed vaguely alarmed by the whole situation, but performed the ceremony with professional efficiency in his small, whitewashed church. His wife as the sole witness. 15 minutes and it was done, words spoken, paper signed, and suddenly Caleb Horne had a wife for the second time in his life. She stood beside him in the churchyard afterward, squinting in the noon sun, her bandaged wrists tucked carefully out of sight beneath her sleeves, and she was a stranger, a complete stranger who now bore his name and to whom he had made promises he fully intended to keep. Strange, she said, not quite to him. Very, he agreed. Yesterday I was cargo. Her voice was flat, almost wondering. Today I'm a wife. Today you're free, he said. The rest is just paperwork. She turned and looked at him for a moment. Something flickered in those gray eyes, not warmth, not yet, but perhaps the first faint shadow of something that was not entirely distrust. We'll see, she said, and she walked back toward the horses, leaving him standing in the churchyard with the sun hot on his face and the distinct and settled certainty that he had done the right thing whatever came next. That night he sat on the porch with his rifle and watched the dark and thought about Silas Voss and everything that was coming. In Prescott, above the red lantern, a man in silver-streaked hair sat behind his massive desk and read the marriage record that his courier had obtained from the county clerk. He read it twice. Then he set it down and reached for the small brass bell on the corner of his desk. So, the rancher thinks a piece of paper will save her, he said to no one in particular. He rang the bell. His men came. 3 days passed in that strange suspended quiet that follows crisis, not peace exactly, but its imitation. The danger hadn't receded. It had simply gone underground, pooling somewhere out of sight, like water finding the level below stone. Adeline moved through the house like a woman learning a new language, one word at a time. She ate when Caleb left food within reach. She slept in short, fitful intervals behind the bolted door of the sewing room. She spoke carefully, measuring every sentence the way a man measures powder, in low supply enough to serve the purpose, not a grain more. And she watched. Her gray eyes tracked Caleb's movements with the patient, exhausting vigilance of someone who had learned that danger came in all shapes and sizes and preferred to arrive when you'd stop looking for it. He gave her room. He understood, or thought he did, that trust wasn't a thing you could ask for or demand or even earn quickly. It accreted slowly the way limestone builds layer by invisible layer over time through nothing more dramatic than consistency. So he went about his work, mended fence, fed cattle, always let her know before he left the yard and when he expected to return. He knocked before entering any room. He kept his voice low and his movements unhurried. He left coffee on the stove every morning and didn't make an occasion of it. On the fourth morning, he came into the kitchen to find her already there, standing at the window, with a cup of coffee cradled between her bandaged hands, watching the light move across the eastern pasture. She didn't turn when he entered, but she spoke the first words she'd offered without a direct question to prompt them. I used to watch the sunrise from my classroom window in Beaumont, she said. The children would arrive just as the light came over the ridge line, and I'd think, this is enough. This simple life. This is mine. A pause. I was a fool. You weren't a fool, Caleb said, moving to the stove. He kept his back to her, giving her the privacy of talking without being watched. You were hopeful. There's a difference, Juan. Is there? Her voice was dry. Hope is what got me onto that train. Hope is what kept me from fighting back for the first 2 days, because I kept thinking someone would notice. Someone would come. A short, empty sound. No one came. I came. A silence, then quietly, eventually. He turned to face her. She was still looking out the window, her profile calm and still the way a face goes when the person wearing it has learned to keep what they feel from showing in their features. He'd seen that look before on men coming back from places they couldn't talk about. The deliberate blankness of someone who had put their interior life somewhere out of reach so that nothing could touch it. Why does everyone want something, she said, and it wasn't quite a question. You keep doing things, the water, the bandages, the marriage bringing me inside, and I keep waiting for the part where you tell me what it costs. It doesn't cost you anything. Everything costs something. She finally turned from the window. The morning light caught the angles of her face, the fine, determined jaw, the dark circles beneath the pale eyes. Men don't do things for nothing. Caleb poured 2 cups of coffee and set one at the end of the table, leaving space between it and himself. He sat down. My wife's name was Nora, he said. She was sick for a long time before she died. A year and a half of watching something take her apart and not being able to stop it. Not being able to do a single useful thing. He wrapped his hands around his cup. That's a particular kind of helplessness, knowing exactly what's happening and having no power over any of it. Adeline had turned fully from the window, now watching him. After she was gone, he continued, I made myself a promise that I wouldn't waste any chance I had to actually help someone, that I wouldn't stand by and do nothing when doing something was possible. He looked up. You were in that wagon. I could do something, so I did. That's a heavy burden, she said slowly, to lay on a stranger's suffering. Maybe, but it's the honest answer. She picked up the coffee cup. Her hands were still unsteady enough that she needed both of them to hold it without spilling, but she managed. She stood there for a moment, and he could see her testing the words against whatever internal measure she used, looking for the crack in them. All right, she said at last. Not warmth, not trust, but the closest thing to it she could manage on 4 days' acquaintance. All right. The sound came without warning just after noon, hoofbeats from the direction of the road. Multiple horses moving with the deliberate pace of men who weren't worried about being noticed. Caleb was at the window before the sound had fully registered, his rifle already in his hand. Get to the back room, he said. Bar the door. Adeline didn't argue. He heard her footsteps down the hall, heard the bolt slide home, and then he was on the porch watching the riders emerge from the dust. 4 of them. He recognized the one in front before the man had gotten close enough to make out his expression, a broad, heavy-shouldered figure with a nose that had been rearranged by someone's fist at some point in the past. He'd been one of the men standing outside the Red Lantern. Voss's. That's close enough, Caleb called out, raising his rifle. The riders pulled up 30 yards from the porch. The broad man smiled, the particular smile of someone who uses it as an instrument rather than an expression. Mr. Horne, Mr. Voss sends his regards. He sat easy and the saddle reins loose. He's a reasonable man. He understands there's been some confusion about the merchandise that was delivered here. He's prepared to offer you a full refund, $350, if you'll return what belongs to him. Nothing here belongs to Voss. The woman does. The smile didn't move. He's got paperwork to prove it. She's my wife. Caleb kept the rifle level. Legally married in Prescott this week, recorded with the county clerk. Whatever paperwork Voss has is void. Something shifted behind the broad man's eyes. Not surprised Voss had clearly told them about the marriage, but recalculation. Mr. Voss sees that as a breach of contract. The man leaned forward slightly in the saddle. He's willing to be generous, Mr. Horne. Take the money, call it a misunderstanding, walk away. I'm going to count to 10, Caleb said. When I reach 10, I start shooting. 1. The broad man's smile disappeared. You're 1 man against 4. The math doesn't. 2. Mr. Horne, I'd advise you to 3. The riders exchanged glances. Something passed between them. Uncertainty, the recalibration that happens when intimidation fails to produce the expected result. 4. All right. The broad man raised one hand, palm out. All right. We're going. He gathered his reins. But this isn't finished, Horne. Mr. Voss doesn't forget, and he doesn't lose. 5, Caleb spun. They rode. He kept the rifle raised until they were out of range, then lowered it slowly, his hands less steady than he would have liked. Behind him, he heard the back door open, then Adeline's footsteps on the porch boards. They'll come back, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes. With more men. She stood beside him, watching the settling dust. Walls won't stop him, Caleb. The marriage slows him down, but it doesn't stop him. He'll find a way. I know that. Then we can't just defend. Her voice had changed. Something had sharpened in it, hardened like iron cooling after the forge. We need to take the fight to him. His power comes from secrecy, from the fact that what he does happens quietly below the surface where no one has to look at it. She turned to face him. But I was there. I was inside it. I know what I saw. Your word against his. My word in evidence. Documents. Witnesses. There have to be others, women, who escaped people who saw something, someone who kept records. Her gray eyes were bright with something that had nothing to do with desperation now. It was cleaner than desperation. More dangerous. He can't have covered every track. Caleb studied her for a long moment. 4 days ago, she had lain in his wagon and asked him to do whatever he'd paid for because she had nothing left to fight with. The woman standing beside him on the porch now was a different person, or the same person maybe finally surfacing from under the weight of what had been done to her. It's dangerous, he said. Everything is dangerous. She didn't look away. At least this way we're moving towards something, instead of waiting for him to come to us. He thought about Nora, about the 18 months of helplessness, about the promise he'd made afterward. All right, he said, but we do it carefully. We do it together. For the first time since he'd found her, something moved in Adeline Marsh's face that wasn't pain or calculation or controlled fear. Something that might, in better light, have been called the beginning of resolve. Then let's start tomorrow, she said. They started before dawn. Caleb knew Prescott well enough to know where information lived and who might be persuaded to share it. His first stop was Walt Greaves at the general store, who listened to what Caleb needed, with his hands pressed flat on the counter and his face cycling through expressions of fear and guilt, and something that finally settled into resolve. There's a woman, Walt said quietly after a long silence. Runs a boarding house on Sycamore Street. Her name is Clara Whitmore. He stopped, glanced toward the door, then lower. She's been watching Voss for years. Her daughter was one of his victims. I don't know what she has, but if anyone in this town knows where the bodies are buried, so to speak, it's her. How do you know about her? Because she came to me a year ago asking if I'd ever noticed anything wrong in my ledgers. I told her no. Walt met his eyes. I was lying. I'd noticed things. I just didn't want to be the one who said so first. Another pause. Don't tell her I sent you. Don't tell anyone you were here. The boarding house on Sycamore Street was a 3-story frame building, clean and respectable, with a porch and dark green shutters. The woman who answered Caleb's knock was perhaps 55, solid gray-haired, with eyes that assessed him in about 3 seconds and didn't share what they concluded. I'm looking for Clara Whitmore, he said. You found her. What do you want? I want to talk about Silas Voss. The assessment in her eyes shifted, not surprise, not alarm, but a kind of sharpening focus. Come inside, she said. She led him to a back parlor that smelled of lemon polish and dried lavender, a room with drawn curtains and a small writing desk covered in papers. She sat across from him and set her hands in her lap and waited with the patience of someone who has learned that patience is its own form of power. My daughter's name was Frances, she said before he'd asked anything. 20 years old. She answered an advertisement for a domestic position in San Francisco. That was 4 years ago. A pause. I've never heard from her since. I'm sorry. What do you want, Mr. Horne? He told her. All of it. The wagon at the fence, Adeline's captivity, the forged signature, the visit to Pishtis, the riders at his porch. Clara Whitmore listened without interrupting, her hands still in her lap, her face giving nothing away. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she rose and went to the writing desk. I've spent 4 years keeping track, she said, pulling open the bottom drawer and removing a leather journal, then a folder stuffed with folded papers. Shipping records, ledger copies, testimony from 3 women who passed through here and were willing to talk before they moved on. She set the papers on the low table between them. I've been waiting for someone with standing to take this further. Someone Voss couldn't dismiss. He might not be able to dismiss a federal judge. Clara looked up sharply. There's a federal judge in Tucson, Harold Drummond. He has a reputation for being the kind of man who cannot be purchased. She paused. But Tucson is 4 days' ride and Voss has eyes on every road between here and there. Then we'll have to be creative about the route. Caleb picked up the journal. Is there more than what's here? There's more. Something moved in Clara Whitmore's steady gaze, something that might have been, after 4 years, the first actual flicker of hope. But I need to meet the woman first. I need to hear her story, and I need to know she's prepared to stand up in court and say it. She's prepared, Caleb said. She's more than prepared. Clara nodded once. Decisive. Bring her tomorrow, she said, and then we'll talk about how to reach Judge Drummond. He rode back to this ranch with Clara's journal in his saddlebag and the feeling fragile, provisional, the kind of feeling you're almost afraid to name, that the situation had shifted. Not in their favor, not yet, but no longer entirely against them. Adeline was sitting on the porch steps when he returned. She rose when she saw his face. You found something, she said. I found someone. He swung down from Flint. A woman named Clara Whitmore. She's been keeping records on Voss for 4 years. Her daughter was one of his victims. Something crossed Adeline's face, a kind of recognition, the sisterhood of specific grief. She wants to meet you, Caleb continued. Tomorrow, she has documentation, shipping records, witness testimony. Combined with what you can tell her, it might be enough to take to a federal judge. Adeline was quiet for a moment, looking at him across the yard in the afternoon light. She had her arms wrapped around herself, not from cold, it was still 90 degrees in the shade, but from something else, something internal. It'll be dangerous, she said, taking this to a judge. Voss will find out. He'll find out either way. Caleb met her eyes. The question is whether we find a way to bring him down before he finds a way to stop us. Another silence. Then Adeline looked at the eastern fence line, the section of fence where the wagon had stood, where all of this had begun, and something set itself in her expression, resolute and a little grim, and not afraid. Tomorrow then, she said, tomorrow. That night, as Caleb sat on the porch watching the stars come out, he heard the door open behind him, and Adeline stepped out and lowered herself to the top step, a blanket around her shoulders. She sat close enough that they were almost side by side, but not quite touching, and she looked at the same sky he was looking at for a while without speaking. Tell me about her, she said at last. Your wife. Caleb looked down at his hands. What do you want to know? Whatever you're willing to say. He thought about it for a moment, then he said, she laughed at herself. That was the first thing I noticed about her, the way she could see the absurdity in a situation and just laugh at herself for being in it. Not bitterly, genuinely. A pause. It's a rare quality. I don't think I ever told her how much I admired it. Adeline was quiet. She used to say that the best thing about living out here was the sky, he continued. That back east, the sky had edges, buildings, trees, the curve of hills. Out here, it just went on. He looked up. She was right about that. She sounds like someone worth grieving, Adeline said softly. She was. He turned to look at her profile. What about you? Was there someone before all this? A long pause. Then there was a man in Beaumont. We'd been keeping company for about a year. Her voice was careful even. When his family found out that I was an orphan, raised at the county home, they decided I wasn't suitable. He tried to argue with them. For about a week. She picked a loose thread on the edge of the blanket. And then he stopped trying. I'm sorry. Don't be. It told me something useful about him. She looked up at the sky. After that, I threw myself into teaching. It was the only thing that was entirely mine that no one could take by deciding I wasn't suitable. A pause. And then I answered an advertisement. They sat in silence after that, the two of them, shoulder almost touching shoulder on the porch steps while the stars wheeled overhead, and somewhere in the middle distance, a coyote called once and went still. It wasn't comfortable exactly, too much damage on both sides, too much recent fear, but it was something, the beginning of a something that didn't have a name yet. Caleb, she said very quietly when she finally rose to go inside. Yes, thank you, for today, for all of it. A pause. I'm not sure I believe this is going to work, but I'm glad we're trying. He looked up at her. We're going to make it work. She held his gaze for a moment, then small and tentative and real, all right. She went inside. He stayed on the porch for another hour, watching the dark, listening for hoofbeats that didn't come, and thinking about the woman sleeping behind the bolted door of the sewing room, and the 4 years of records in his saddlebag, and Judge Harold Drummond in Tucson, and all the roads between here and there that Silas Voss was watching. In Prescott, the broad-shouldered man with the rearranged nose sat across from his employer and reported what he had seen at the Horne Ranch. Voss listened with his pale eyes level and his hands folded on the desk. Find out who he's been talking to, Voss said when the man finished. Start with the general store. Clara Whitmore met them at the door of the boarding house before they'd finished tying their horses, which told Caleb she'd been watching for them, and had been watching for some time. She looked at Adeline with the particular attention of a woman who had spent 4 years learning to recognize a certain kind of story in another person's face. Come inside, she said, both of you. She led them to the back parlor. Tea was already waiting on the low table along with a plate of biscuits that no one touched. Clara sat across from them and set her hands in her lap and looked at Adeline. Tell me, she said simply. Adeline told her. She started in Beaumont with the newspaper advertisement and the careful, plausible letter that had followed her inquiry. She described the men waiting at the train station in San Antonio, the wagon that was already moving, before she understood what was happening, the days of travel in darkness and heat. She described the other women, 4 of them at different points along the route, glimpsed in other wagons or heard through canvas walls. She described the man who called himself the manager, who spoke to her once and told her she had been purchased by a rancher in Arizona and should count herself fortunate. Clara wrote in a small leather notebook throughout. She asked questions, precise, unemotional questions about routes and timing and physical descriptions, and Adeline answered them all with the same controlled steadiness. She didn't look at Caleb during the telling. She kept her eyes on Clara or on the space between them, focused inward on the accuracy of what she was recounting. When she finished, Clara set down her pen and was quiet for a moment. Voss has been running this for at least 6 years, she said. Probably longer. The advertisements are placed in newspapers across the South and Midwest. They target women in specific circumstances. Educated women, working women, women without close family, women who would be missed slowly, if at all. She opened the folder from the desk. I have shipping manifests where women are listed as dry goods or household supplies. I have copies of contracts that use coded language to describe human purchases. I have testimony from 3 survivors written and signed. She set the papers on the table. And now I have you. Is it enough? Caleb asked. It should be enough for Judge Drummond to issue a warrant. Clara's voice was measured. The difficulty is getting it to him before Voss has a chance to intercept the attempt. She paused. There's one more resource I want to bring in. A man named Henry Price, retired U.S. Marshal living in Prescott now. He's the one who first told me about Drummond. He has no connection to Voss, and he has standing that neither of you has. You trust him? I've trusted him for 2 years. He's been waiting, same as I have, for someone to bring enough evidence together to make this worth the risk. Clara looked between the 2 of them. We need to meet with him. Today, if possible, before Voss's people have time to figure out you've been here. Then let's go now, Adeline said. Henry Price lived in a small frame house on the north edge of town, behind a kitchen garden that he appeared to tend with the same methodical attention he'd probably brought to his former profession. He was in his late 60s, lean and leathery, with the careful eyes of a man who had spent decades in rooms where the wrong move got people killed. He listened to everything: Clara's documentation, Adeline's account, Caleb's description of the events at the ranch without speaking. When they finished, he was silent for a moment. Drummond will act on this, he said. I know the man. He won't look the other way. He picked up Clara's shipping manifests and studied them. The problem is the road. Every route south to Tucson goes through country Voss controls or influences. He'll have men watching if he suspects what you're planning. What about sending a telegraph? Caleb asked. from where Voss owns the telegraph operator in Prescott. Price set the papers down. But there's a town called Mineral Springs 20 miles east on the edge of the mountains. Small place outside Voss's direct reach. The telegraph office there is run by a woman named Evie Cole, no relation to your UTS. She just has the same name who has her own reasons to dislike Voss. Can she be trusted to send a message to Drummond? Trusted completely. Price rose stiffly from his chair. I'll ride with you. If it comes to a confrontation on the road, 2 rifles are better than 1. It may come to more than a confrontation, Caleb said. Price looked at him steadily. I spent 30 years in service of federal law, son. I know what men like Voss do to people who get in their way. I've seen the results. He picked up his hat from the peg by the door. That's precisely why I'm going. They rode out of Prescott before noon, 4 of them, Caleb, Adeline, Clara, and Price, taking the eastern road that wound up into the foothills. The sun was at its peak, the heat making the air over the road shimmer and dance. No one spoke much. The horses moved steadily, and Caleb watched the terrain on both sides with the attention of a man who knows he's being watched. They were an hour out of town when the trouble found them. 3 riders came out of the scrub on the left side of the road, not fast, not charging, just emerging with the unhurried deliberateness of men who had been waiting and had plenty of time. The broad-shouldered man was in the center. He reined in across the road and sat easy, blocking the way forward. Mr. Horne, he looked past Caleb to Clara and Price. Miss Whitmore, Marshal Price. He said the last name with particular emphasis, making it clear that nothing they'd done in the past several hours had been private. Mr. Voss sends his regards. He'd like you to turn around. We're on a public road, Price said. His voice was flat and professional. You have no authority to block it. Mr. Voss has authority enough. The broad man's eyes moved to Adeline. She's the problem. The rest of you can ride on. She rides with us, Caleb said. That's unfortunate. The broad man's hand moved toward his hip. Because he didn't finish the sentence. Price had drawn with the unhurried speed of someone who had practiced the motion 40,000 times and no longer needed to think about it, and the barrel of his revolver was pointing at the broad man's chest before the man's fingers had closed on his own grip. I wouldn't, Price said pleasantly. A long, frozen moment. The 3 riders looked at the gun, at Price's face, at Caleb, whose rifle had come up somewhere during the same interval. The broad man looked from one to the other. Something that might have been a calculation going badly wrong moved through his expression. You're making a serious mistake, he said. Turn around, Price said. Ride back to town. Tell Voss that Henry Price sends his regards and that federal law is coming for him whether he likes it or not. Another moment. Then the broad man gathered his reins, gave a short jerk of his head to his companions, and they rode back into the scrub. Price holstered his weapon without particular drama. They'll report back, he said. We have perhaps 4 hours before Voss decides on his next move. We need to reach Mineral Springs. They pushed the horses hard for the rest of the afternoon. The terrain climbed as they moved east, the scrubland giving way to pine and juniper, in the higher elevations the air cooling by degrees until Adeline had pulled her jacket closed against it. No one came after them on the road. Whether that meant Voss was waiting for a better opportunity or simply regrouping, Caleb couldn't tell. Mineral Springs was small, a handful of buildings gathered around a central well, a general store, a livery, a church. The telegraph office was in the back of the post office, run by a woman in her 40s with iron gray braids and eyes the color of dark earth, who looked at Price when he introduced himself and said simply, I've been expecting this, eventually. Caleb dictated the message himself carefully, a summary of Voss's operation. The documentation Clara was prepared to provide, the request for federal intervention, the urgency. Evie Cole listened, nodded once, and bent to her key. The clicks filled the small room. How long before a reply, Adeline asked. Depends on whether the judge is in his office. Evie glanced up. Could be an hour, could be tomorrow morning. We'll wait, Caleb said. They took rooms at the boarding house above the general store, 2 rooms, Clara and Adeline in one, Caleb and Price in the other, and Caleb spent the night at the window watching the road, while Price slept with the easy economy of a man who learned long ago to sleep whenever the opportunity presented itself. Shortly before dawn, a knock at the door. Evie Cole. Reply came in, she said, holding out a folded paper. About an hour ago, I didn't want to wake you until I'd read it through. Caleb unfolded it. Evidence received. Warrant being prepared. Federal deputies departing Tucson at first light. Expect arrival within 72 hours. Hold your position and do not engage. Drummond. He read it twice, then he exhaled a long, slow release of something that had been compressed inside his chest for days. Adeline was in the doorway of the next room watching him. He held up the paper. She crossed the hall and read it and didn't say anything for a moment. When she looked up, her eyes were bright. 72 hours, she said. We just have to stay ahead of Voss for 3 days. We've been doing that so far. She folded the paper carefully and handed it back. Her fingers brushed his in the exchange just briefly, just for a moment, and neither of them moved away immediately. We can keep doing it. In Prescott, a rider arrived at the Red Lantern while it was still dark and went upstairs without stopping in the bar. Silas Voss was already awake. He slept less and less these days, which he attributed to the natural reduction of needs that came with age, and he received the report sitting behind his desk in the lamplight. He listened to everything. When the rider finished, Voss was quiet for a long time. So they've sent a telegraph to Drummond, he said at last. Yes, sir. And federal deputies are coming. He picked up a pen and turned it in his fingers. How many witnesses do they have now? The woman from the wagon, Whitmore and her documents, Price to vouch for it all, and the rider hesitated. I heard from my man in Mineral Springs that 2 other women came to the boarding house there last night. Women who'd been through something similar, looking for the people who could help them. Voss set the pen down. It's spreading, he said quietly, not panicked, simply recognizing a fact. How far we've come in 3 days. He looked at the wall for a moment. Then gather the men, all of them. He rose from his desk. If Drummond's deputies are coming, we have 3 days to end this before they arrive. 3 days to make it clear that there is no case, no witnesses, no evidence worth pursuing. He straightened his collar with the methodical precision of a man getting dressed for an important meeting. 3 days is enough. The morning of the second day in Mineral Springs came in cold and still, the sky a pale washed-out blue with clouds building to the west that might mean rain or might mean nothing. Caleb had been awake for most of the night and was on his second cup of coffee when Price came to find him at the window. Ryder came through before dawn, Price said without preamble. He pulled out a chair and sat across the table. A man named Garrett, who used to work for Voss and decided some weeks ago that he'd rather not end up in a territorial prison. He brought word. What word? Voss is moving, gathering all his men leaving Prescott today. He knows about the telegraph. He knows deputies are coming, and he's calculated that he has 3 days to make us irrelevant. Price set his hat on the table. He's coming here. Caleb processed this. How many men? Garrett said 15. Maybe more by the time they reach us. The number settled on the table between them. We can't fight 15 men, Caleb said. No, Price picked up his hat and turned it in his hands. But we might not have to fight them. We just have to last 3 days. Last how? We're in a town of 40 people. Voss can ride in here and take what he wants. Maybe. Price looked at him steadily. Or maybe Voss has a problem he hasn't fully accounted for. He explained while Caleb listened. By the time he'd finished, Adeline and Clara had appeared in the doorway, both of them dressed and alert in the way of people who had not slept well and had been listening through the wall. We're going to use the town, Adeline said. She'd absorbed what she'd heard quickly. Caleb noted she pulled together the implications in moments. We don't have a choice, Price said. The people in this town have been living in Voss's shadow for years. Some of them know what he is. Some of them have their own losses. He looked at Clara. You know this territory better than any of us. Are there people here who might be willing to stand up? Clara thought for a moment. Then she rose and put on her coat. Let me go first, she said. People respond differently to a woman asking than to a man with a badge. She was gone for 3 hours. When she came back, she had a quiet determination about her that was different from the controlled endurance she'd worn before. 8 people, she said. 8 who are willing to stand as witnesses if it comes to a confrontation. More who'll watch from windows. She sat down. They've been waiting for this, most of them. They just needed someone to start. The rest of the day was preparation. Price organized it with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had spent 3 decades making plans in difficult situations. Not military precision, but something practical and human accounting for the fact that these were farmers and tradespeople, not soldiers who would scatter if things went badly wrong. Caleb spent the afternoon with Adeline going over her testimony again, not because she needed to practice it, but because something about the act of speaking it aloud clearly and without flinching seemed to do something useful for both of them. She sat across the table from him and described what had been done to her with the measured steadiness of someone who has decided that the events belong to the past and the past cannot touch her unless she lets it, and he listened with his hands flat on the table and his face still. "You don't have to do this in front of a crowd," he said when she'd finished. "Yes, I do." She looked at him directly. "That's exactly what I have to do, because every minute I stay quiet is a minute that the women still in Voss's network are being moved somewhere further away from anyone who can help them." A pause. "I didn't survive what I survived, so I could stay quiet." He looked at her face. At the particular quality of stillness in it, not resignation, not even courage exactly, but something more fundamental: clarity. She had looked at what she was going to do, and she had accepted it, and she was not afraid of it. "All right," he said. "Will you stay close?" She asked it without flourish, without apology. "Yes," he said simply. Evening came. Price posted a watch on the road. Caleb sat with Adeline on the steps outside the boarding house, the sky going through its enormous color changes overhead, and they talked not about Voss, not about what was coming, but about other things. About Beaumont and what she'd taught her students and which ones she thought about still. About the ranch and what it had been like before Nora died and what he'd hoped it might become. Small, specific things. The kind of things you talk about when you're trying to remember that life extends past the edge of the crisis you're standing in. The watch rider came back at midnight. They were a day out, maybe less. Voss was moving faster than Price had projected. "He's not going to wait for us to get comfortable," Price said, pulling everyone together in the small front room of the boarding house. His voice was even matter-of-fact. "He'll arrive tomorrow morning, probably at first light. He wants to hit us before the town is fully awake." And the deputies from Tucson, 2 days away at best. The arithmetic was ungenerous. "Then we hold," Caleb said. "One day. We hold him off for one today." Price looked around the room at Caleb, Adeline, Clara, Evie, Cole, who had come with her shotgun, the 8 townspeople arranged around the walls. His expression was steady. "One day," he agreed. "No one slept. Or rather, everyone slept a little, and it felt like nothing." Caleb sat on the front porch of the boarding house with his rifle and listened to the desert breathe and thought with a clarity that surprised him about how much he wanted to get through this. Not in an abstract sense. Specifically, concretely, he wanted to get through this morning and make it to the next one and the one after that and build something here that deserved to be built. The thought arrived with Adeline's face attached to it, and he didn't push either away. Around 4 in the morning, she came out and sat beside him on the steps. Not speaking. Just present her shoulder close to his, the blanket around her shoulders. "When this is over," she said after a long time. "Yes. I'd like to go back to the ranch." She said it carefully, like something she was trying the weight of. "For a while, if that's all right." "It's your home," he said, "for as long as you want it to be." She turned to look at him. In the pre-dawn dark, her face was hard to read, but he could see the shape of what was in it. "It might be more than a while," she said. He held her gaze. "That's all right, too." She looked away, back out at the dark road, but she didn't move away. Dawn came gray and cold, mist rising from the ground in thin tendrils, the mountains visible in outline against a lightning sky. The birds started up small, tentative sounds, as though even they were uncertain what the morning was going to bring. The sound of hoofbeats came from the west at 6:30. Many hoofbeats. Not the thunder of a charge, but the steady, deliberate percussion of a large group moving at pace which was worse in its way. It spoke of confidence, of men who expected no resistance and were not hurrying because they didn't need to. Caleb stood from the porch steps. Around him in doorways and at windows, the town of Mineral Springs arranged itself as they had planned, 8 people visible more behind glass. Price came to stand at his left. Adeline at his right, Clara a step behind. Silas Voss rode into Mineral Springs at the head of 16 men, and he looked exactly as he had the day Caleb had sat across his desk, immaculate, composed, his silver-streaked hair swept back from his broad forehead, his pale eyes moving across the scene in front of him with the assessing calm of a man who has never seen a situation he couldn't control. He reined in the center of the road and looked at Caleb. "Mr. Horne," he said, conversational, almost warm. I was hoping we could settle this before it became any more complicated than it already is. Then you've ridden a long way for nothing. Voss looked past him at Adeline. Something in his pale eyes shifted, not anger exactly, but the particular cold attention of a man accounting for an inconvenient variable. My dear, he said, whatever he's told you, don't. Her voice cut across his with quiet, absolute finality. Don't speak to me as though we're acquainted. You don't know me. You tried to sell me. Voss absorbed this without visible reaction. He looked at Price. Henry, I'd expected better from you. I'd expected better from you too, Silas. About 20 years ago, I stopped being surprised. Price's voice was even. You're under federal investigation. Deputies out of Tucson are on their way. You can make this easier by not adding assault and kidnapping charges to what's already coming. I don't see any deputies, Voss said pleasantly. Not yet. Voss was quiet for a moment. He looked at the buildings, at the faces in the windows, the people in the doorways. His men sat their horses in a loose line behind him, and Caleb watched them with his peripheral vision, watching for the one who would move first. You understand what you're doing, Voss addressed the town. Not Caleb, not Price, the people in the buildings, the witnesses. You're taking the word of a grieving widower and a woman who arrived here under suspicious circumstances over the word of a man who has been part of this community for 20 years. You're risking your livelihoods, your property, your safety on the strength of a telegraph message and some papers that can be challenged in any court in this territory. A silence. My daughter's name was Frances, Clara said. She stepped forward from behind Caleb and Adeline, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. She was 20 years old. She answered one of your advertisements 4 years ago, and I have never heard from her since. I have your shipping manifest with her listed as dry goods. She held up a paper visible to everyone. Does anyone here want to tell me that's not enough reason to take this seriously? A man stepped out of the general store, middle-aged, broad-shouldered, with the look of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time. My sister, he said. 2 years ago, a woman from the church doorway. My niece, another voice from further back. My wife. They came forward one by one, not many but enough. Enough to stand in the road between Voss's men and the building where Adeline stood. Enough to constitute a fact. Something changed in Voss's face. Not breaking, not cracking. Caleb didn't think Silas Voss was a man who broke easily, but a recalculation. A realization that the arithmetic of the situation had changed while he wasn't looking. His hand moved toward his coat. Don't, Caleb said. His rifle came up. Price's came up beside it. And to their left, from an alley, a double click that was unmistakably Evie Cole's shotgun. This is over, Voss. The evidence is already in Tucson. It went yesterday by courier. Whatever happens here this morning, it won't change what the federal court is going to find. Voss stared at him across the road. There were copies, he said. Clara's been doing this for 4 years. Did you think she'd keep it all in one place? Something that might have been in another man. The first acknowledgement of defeat moved through Voss's pale eyes. He was still calculating. Caleb could see it, still looking for the angle, the way out, the move that changed the game. He hadn't found it yet, but the riders behind him were shifting. Not moving to draw, moving away from it. One man's hands had come up from his sides, open and visible. Another had eased his horse half a step back. They were men who had been paid for their loyalty, and men paid for their loyalty had a way of counting very precisely what the payment was actually worth. Tell me something, Silas, Price said into the silence. Was it worth it? All of it. The money, the influence, the 20 years of looking over your shoulder and making sure every man in your pocket stayed bought. Was it worth what it cost the people you did it to? Voss looked at him. Everything has a price, he said. That's all I ever understood. Everything has a price, and someone is always willing to pay it. Then your time to pay is coming, Price said. One way or another this morning or in a federal courtroom, it's coming. The silence stretched. Then slowly Voss dropped his hand from his coat. He looked at Caleb one more time, not with hatred, not with defeat, but with the look of a man filing something away for later consideration. We'll let the courts decide, he said. Yes, Caleb said. We will. Voss turned his horse. His men followed. Not fleeing, there was no panic in it, no broken retreat. Just a withdrawal, deliberate and controlled, the way a man like Voss did everything. But they went. The road emptied. Adeline exhaled a long, shaking breath that she'd been holding for what felt like most of the morning. Caleb lowered his rifle. Beside him, Price did the same. "He's not done," Price said quietly. "That wasn't surrender." "I know," Caleb said. "He'll try something before the deputies arrive." "I know that too." "Then we watch through the night and we don't assume anything." "Yes." Caleb turned and found Adeline's eyes on him, steady and clear. He said to her quietly, just for her, "You all right?" "Yes," she said, and then with something in her voice that hadn't been there before, warmth, or the beginning of it, arriving without announcement, "Yes, I am." They watched through the night in shifts, 3 of them awake at any given time, while the town held its breath around them. The clouds that had been building all day came through after midnight, dropping a soft rain that pattered on the roof of the boarding house and turned the road to mud and reduced visibility to almost nothing, which was both a comfort and a concern. Voss made his move at 3 in the morning, not with riders on the road, with fire. The smell reached Caleb before the light did smoke, sharp and wrong at that hour, and he was out of bed and at the window before he was fully awake. The feed barn at the far end of the street was burning flames, crawling up the dry wood of its walls, with the avid, indifferent hunger of fire that has found purchase. He could see figures retreating into the dark on the far side of it. 3 men, maybe 4, moving fast. Within minutes, the whole town was awake. Someone had organized a bucket line from the well almost before Caleb reached the street. Evie Cole, he realized, directing the operation with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had drilled for exactly this contingency and wasn't surprised to find it necessary. He joined the line and worked beside the others for 2 hours until the fire was out the barn, a ruin of char and steam, 2 of the townspeople's horses lost. No one was hurt. Whether that was luck or Voss's deliberate choice, damage without murder pressure, without the thing that would make everything irreversible, Caleb couldn't tell. When it was over, he stood in the road with mud on his boots and soot on his coat and looked at what was left. Clara came to stand beside him. "He's trying to make them afraid," she said, "trying to make the witnesses decide it's not worth it. Is it working?" She looked down the road at the townspeople gathered around the remains of the barn, some of them frightened, yes, but the ones who had stepped forward yesterday morning were still standing together, still talking to each other, with the particular body language of people who have decided something and are holding to it. "Not yet," she said. Adeline found him as the sky was beginning to lighten, a thin gray smoke-smelling dawn that felt like the aftermath of something. She had ash on her coat, and her hair had come loose from its arrangement, and she looked utterly exhausted and utterly determined. "2 more women came in during the night," she said, "from Prescott. They'd been waiting at Whitmore's boarding house, and when they heard what was happening, here they followed." She paused. "They want to testify." Caleb looked at her. "It keeps growing," she said. "That's what he doesn't understand. Every time he does something like this," she gestured at the ruined barn, "he thinks he's reducing the problem. But he's making it bigger. Every person who sees what he's willing to do becomes another reason for someone else to stand up. He'll figure that out eventually. I hope it's too late by the time he does." She met his eyes. "How much longer until the deputies?" "Price thinks today, maybe this afternoon." She nodded. Her jaw was set, her pale eyes steady. She had moved over the past days from the raw survival mode watchfulness of the woman he'd found in the wagon to something more settled in herself, not hard, not armored, but clear. Like water after sediment has finally had time to fall. "Then we hold until this afternoon," she said. Voss came back at noon. He came alone this time. No riders, no men at his back. Just Silas Voss on a gray horse riding into Minville Springs from the west, at a walk dressed with his usual precision, his pale eyes taking in the ruined barn and the people gathered in the street without any readable expression. He stopped in the center of the road and looked at Caleb. "I'd like to speak with you," he said. "Alone." "No," Adeline said from Caleb's left. Voss looked at her, something moved through his expression, the reassessment of a man encountering an opponent he has consistently underestimated. "I wasn't speaking to you," he said. "She's standing here," Caleb said. "She stays." A pause. Then Voss looked at the sky, at the ruins of the barn, at the people arranged behind Caleb and Adeline. His face had changed since yesterday morning, not softened. Caleb didn't think that was possible, but something had shifted in the precise, careful stillness of it. "The deputies will be here in a few hours," Voss said. I know that. I'm not here to stop them. He looked at Caleb directly. I'm here to ask what it would cost to make this quiet. Not the charges, I understand, those are beyond either of us now. But the scope, the additional witnesses, the public nature of what's about to happen. You want a deal, Price said, stepping forward. I want to understand my options. You have one option, Caleb said. You turn over everything you have, every record, every associate, every name of every buyer, and you give it to the federal deputies when they arrive. That's the only conversation left to have. Voss looked at him for a long moment. Everything I've built, he said, everything you built on other people's suffering? Yes. Another silence, a long one. And in it something that might have been somewhere beneath the calculation and the cold intelligence. In the 20 years of protected criminality, a recognition. Not remorse, Caleb didn't believe the man was capable of it, not in any form he'd recognize. But something. The acknowledgement, perhaps, of having reached the end of something. I'll need your word, Voss said, that the information I provide won't be used to accelerate a death sentence. That's for the federal court to determine, Price said. What us? Voss looked at the sky again, at the mountains to the east. All right, he said, quiet, final. Send for the deputies. When the federal deputies rode into Mineral Springs 3 hours later, 6 of them led by a deputy marshal named Cook, who had the weathered, seen everything face of a man who had spent 30 years in difficult places, they found Silas Voss seated on the steps of the general store with his hands in his lap, waiting. He didn't resist. He didn't bargain. He gave them his records, his associates, the names of every buyer in his network, the locations of women currently in transit. He gave them all of it with the defeated thoroughness of a man who has decided that if the game is over, it is over completely. Cook took the records and looked at Caleb over Voss's head with the expression of a man who has arrived to find more and less than he expected in roughly equal measure. You Horne, he said. Yes. Drummond wants a full deposition. From you, from the woman from Whitmore and Price. He looked around at the assembled townspeople, the ruined barn, the women who had arrived through the night. Looks like you've been busy. We were trying to stay alive, Caleb said. Cook almost smiled. That counts. The days that followed were not simple. Federal investigations are never simple, and the process of disentangling Voss's network, which stretched across 7 territories in 3 states, encompassing 43 documented victims and an unknown number of buyers, was the work of months, not weeks. Caleb and Adeline spent 10 days in Mineral Springs giving depositions, then 2 weeks in Tucson, where Judge Drummond presided over the preliminary proceedings with the careful, thorough attention of a man who understood that the record being created here would matter for a long time. Adeline testified twice. She stood in the federal courtroom both times with her hands quiet in her lap and her voice level, and she said everything, all of it, clearly and without equivocation, and she did not look away from Voss when she said it. He sat at the defendant's table in both sessions, and he watched her with his pale, still eyes, and he said nothing. His lawyers objected. He himself said nothing. It was as though he had made a decision somewhere in that final hour in Mineral Springs about what kind of end this was going to be. The trial concluded in November. Voss was convicted on 17 federal counts. His sentence was life imprisonment. Clara Whitmore was in the courtroom for the verdict. Caleb sat beside her, and he watched her face when the judge read the sentence, and what he saw there was complicated relief and grief tangled together in a way that probably made sense to anyone who had spent 4 years fighting toward a moment and then had to stand inside it and discover that it didn't bring back what was lost. Francis, she said quietly. We'll keep looking, Adeline said from Clara's other side. She took the older woman's hand. All the records he gave them there are names and locations. We'll keep looking until we find her. Clara nodded. She didn't speak again for a while, but she held Adeline's hand. They rode back to the ranch in early December, the two of them, through a country that had gone from the bronzed heat of late summer to the clear cold of high desert winter. The mountains to the east held snow on their upper reaches, and the air smelled of juniper and the particular clean emptiness that comes with altitude and cold. They rode at an easy pace, neither of them in a hurry, both of them tired in the deep-down way that takes weeks to leave. It doesn't feel the way I thought it would, Adeline said when they crested the last ridge and could see the ranch below them, the house, the barn, the windmill turning slowly in the afternoon light. What did you think it would feel like? Finished maybe, like something completed. She looked at the landscape, but it doesn't feel finished. It feels like the beginning of a longer thing. That's what it is, Caleb said. Voss is convicted, but the networks he was part of didn't end with him. The women they never found won't stop being missing just because he's in a cell. He looked at her. You know that. Yes. She looked down at the ranch. And Clara knows that. And the women who came to Mineral Springs. A pause. I've been thinking about what to do with that. He waited. The ranch is big enough, she said. We have the space. And there will be women who need somewhere to come, women who escape, women who are found women who have nowhere to go while they figure out what comes next. She looked at him. I want to make it into something, a place, somewhere they can come and be safe and start over. He thought about the spare bedroom where she'd spent her first nights, the sewing room with its bolt on the inside of the door. All right, he said. It'll be a lot of work. Yes. We'll need help. Clara would come, and Price probably in some capacity, and there will be others. He looked at her. You built something back there, Adeline, in Mineral Springs. People came toward it. That doesn't happen unless you're doing something right. She looked at him for a long moment, the wind moving through the loose strands of hair at her temples, the late afternoon light making everything the color of old gold. Come on, she said. Let's go home. And they rode down to the ranch together and put the horses up and went inside, and Caleb built a fire in the kitchen stove while Adeline moved through the rooms with the particular attention of someone relearning a space, touching things, looking out windows, deciding what it was. She found him in the kitchen. There's something I want to ask you, she said. He waited. For all of this, before the wagon, before Voss, before any of it, you said you'd been waiting for a chance to do something that mattered. And then I showed up, and you decided I was it. She sat across the table from him. I want to know if you still feel that way, now that you've seen all of it, now that you know what it actually done. He held her gaze steadily. Yes. Even now, especially now. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I need to say something, and I need you to let me say it without making it easier. All right. I was cargo. For weeks, I was an object being transported, and I had stopped believing that anything else was possible. And then you cut the rope off my wrists, and you gave me water, and you said my name like it mattered. Her voice was steady, clear, the voice of someone who has decided to say a true thing and is not afraid of it. I didn't trust you. I didn't trust anything. But you kept being the same consistent, quiet present until eventually trusting you was easier than not trusting you. She looked at him. That's not a small thing, Caleb. That might be the most important thing anyone has ever done for me. You did the harder part, he said. Maybe we both did the hard parts. She reached across the table. Her hands settled over his, warm and deliberate. I'm not leaving. I want you to know that. Not because I have nowhere else to go. Because I'm choosing to be here. With you. He turned his hand over and held hers. I'm glad, he said. And then because it was true, and the moment was one of the rare ones where the true thing and the right thing were exactly the same. I love you, Adeline. I don't know exactly when that happened, but it did. She looked at him for a long, steady moment. It happened for me somewhere in the mountains, she said. When you stayed between me and those men, even though the mathematics were terrible. A faint smile. I love you too, Caleb Horne. The fire crackled in the stove. Outside, the December light was turning the desert gold, and then copper, and then the deep blue of early evening, and somewhere in the house the sound of the wind found a loose board and spoke through it in a low continuous note, and it was if not perfectly quiet then close enough. They were married properly in the spring, not for legal protection this time, but because they wanted to be in front of Clara Whitmore and Henry Price and Evie Cole from Mineral Springs, and the first 3 women who had come to stay at the ranch. The ceremony was brief and uncomplicated, performed by a traveling judge who seemed genuinely glad to be officiating something that wasn't a lawsuit for once. Adeline wore a blue dress the color of a clear winter sky, and Caleb wore his best coat, and they said their words in the yard in the morning light, with the mountains visible in every direction. Clara cried. Price did not, but he came close. The sanctuary, as they came to call it, grew slowly and then quickly, the way things grow when the conditions are right. Clara moved out within the month, bringing her documentation and her 4 years of contacts. Price organized a system discrete communications safe routes, coordination with federal marshals through which women who had escaped Voss's fractured network could find their way to the ranch. Some stayed a week, some stayed a season, some stayed longer and took jobs on the ranch or in Prescott and built lives that were genuinely their own. Frances Whitmore was found in February in Sacramento working as a seamstress for a manufacturing concern that turned out under investigation to have been a front for another trafficking network with loose ties to Voss's operation. She was brought home to Clara in the spring, thin and quiet, and damaged in ways that would take a long time to heal. But she was alive. She was found. Caleb was the one who told Clara, and he stood beside her while she wept, and he thought about Nora, about the promise he'd made himself in the dark hours after her death. And he thought that the weight of keeping a promise was nothing compared to the weight of having kept it. By the summer, 6 women were living at the ranch in various stages of whatever it meant to start over. And the back bedroom had been converted to a schoolroom where Adeline taught reading and writing and arithmetic to anyone who wanted to learn the way she had in Beaumont, except that this time the students were women who were rebuilding something rather than children who were beginning it, and that was in some ways harder and in some ways better. They had their difficulties. Money was tight in the first year and loose thereafter when Clara organized a collection among people who had their own reasons to want the work to continue. There were women who came to the ranch and couldn't stay, too frightened, too damaged, too determined to disappear entirely and be unreachable. There were cases that couldn't be solved, women who were never found corners of Voss's network that had sealed themselves shut against investigation. There were nights when Adeline lay awake in the dark and the weight of it all pressed down on her with its full force, and Caleb would reach for her hand in the darkness and hold it without speaking, which was usually exactly the right thing. And there were other nights, many of them, and more as the years passed, when the house was full of women learning to trust their own futures again, and the smell of coffee filled the kitchen in the mornings, and the children of the women who had stayed ran through the yard in the afternoon light, and Adeline stood at the window watching it all with her hands wrapped around her cup, and something in her expression that was simply uncomplicated at rest. Years later, when the ranch had expanded and the sanctuary had become something of a model for similar efforts in other territories, and Caleb had gray at his temples and Adeline's hair had gone the color of winter clouds, they walked out together on a morning in early autumn to the eastern fence line. The post where the wagon had stood was still there. They'd never taken it down. Adeline stood beside it for a moment. "Do you ever think about it?" she asked. "How close it came to going the other way?" "Sometimes." He stood beside her close enough that their shoulders touched. Does it still hurt when you think about it?" She considered this with the honest attention she gave to everything. "It aches," she said, "not in the same place as it used to, more like an old injury that you only notice in certain weather." She looked at the fence posts, then at the ranch behind them, then at him. "But when I think about what came out of it, what we built, what we found, the ache seems like a fair price." He took her hand. "We saved each other," she said. "That's what it comes down to, isn't it? You saved me from what Voss was going to do. I saved you from spending the rest of your life alone on this ranch, grieving for something you couldn't change." She looked at him. "We're even." "We're more than even," he said. She smiled, the full, real smile that had arrived so cautiously in those first weeks and then gradually stopped being cautious at all. The smile that was his favorite thing in a life that had, against all probability, and by the choosing of 2 wounded people who had decided to try, filled itself up with things worth having. They stood at the fence until the morning light was fully up and the desert was burning gold in every direction. Then they turned and walked back toward the house together, where the sound of voices and the smell of coffee and the work that waited for them. Good work, hard work, the kind that never quite finishes but never stops mattering either. The Arizona sky wheeled overhead, enormous and indifferent and extraordinarily beautiful. They walked into it.